Welcome to Boss Builds, where we here at Dungeonmancers take ordinary monsters and make them extraordinary. Today we discuss air elementals. I'm joined here with my great friend Mick Daggers.
Hello.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, thank you. How are you doing, Boulder?
I'm doing... but things are going. These are difficult times.
It's better than the alternative.
Yes. But
All right, so today,
we are
what are we
discussing
talking about?
the great air elementals and
Ooh.
what are some things that you enjoy about this creature?
So, air elementals, like other elementals, are a fixture in the idea of tabletop in 5e. They express a certain element very explicitly. They are air elementals. But much like the water elemental, they're not a fixture that works in only 2 dimensions. They are a creature, an adversary that works in 3 dimensions. There's so much versatility that the air elemental has. And it's not something that an adventurer would come across often. So when it does come, it is unique and perhaps frightful.
I think one of my favorite things about the air elemental is the fact that it does have a flying capability, which entails that once your players start picking up fly spells and being able to get around in the air, occasionally battles can become a lot easier. But enemies like air elementals with a 90-foot fly speed are able to still give those players a good challenge and perhaps knock them off their pedestal that they have found themselves on.
Exactly. You know, a thought that I had about air elementals, this is when you transition the idea of a regular party dynamic. It shifts because you have your frontliners, your heavy hitters, your paladins, your barbarians, your fighters. On the occasion, your rogue is going to get in the mess as well in melee. But with an air elemental, this is when range DPS becomes very important.
Yes.
They become the star of the fight. And it's not just a one cast kind of fireball deal.
No.
They really have to operate consistently against an enemy in which they are most effective compared to their fellow fighters. So this really it flips the switch as far as how the group dynamic works.
Oh yeah, especially because they have that awesome whirlwind ability. Just a baseline air elemental has a whirlwind ability where they get to potentially fling people away from them. It is a strength saving throw, so most of those frontliners will probably have a good chance of succeeding unless you up the DC, which you probably should be doing if you're running this for higher level party members.
Absolutely. It's one of those things where even the baseline air elemental has a mechanic that disrupts your typical sword and board, we're going to get crits out of the wazoo type of fight. The air elemental balances that. But with our own design, with a boss type air elemental, I think you can push that idea even further.
Oh, yes.
And I know you had some thoughts about that. So what were you thinking? How do you turn a regular 5e air elemental into something that's really fearsome?
So when I was kind of brainstorming about air elementals, I like the whirlwind ability, but I wanted something to kind of pair it with, to kind of have a little bit of a marriagement between 2 abilities that I can give this air elemental. So I thought of something more akin to like a levitate spell, but it's like a burst that this air elemental can let out. And in my mind, it's probably more akin to like a legendary action. So on his turn, he lets out his whirlwind attack. Maybe he blasts everybody away from him, and then whoever goes on their next turn, he activates his legendary action and lets out this AoE levitate, and anybody in like a 30, maybe 40-foot radius of the air elemental gets this. They make a Constitution saving throw, probably make it the same DC as whatever you set the Strength saving throw on the whirlwind, and immediately they are lifted 20 feet in the air, and then it ends after that same exact action. So it lifts them another 20 feet in the air before ending. So they do a total of 40 feet in the air drop. You're doing 46 fall damage, and you've effectively taken probably a couple melee fighters, maybe some other ranged characters. You've taken their movement speed away from them by making them levitate. So they have to begin to think how they're going to even be useful in this situation where they're lifted 20 feet in the air and they're, however many feet away from the air elemental after it flew using its 90-foot movement speed.
Absolutely. And I think this touches on an important point. I think boss level elementals, they don't just have control of themselves. That's kind of the whole idea of an elemental, is they can move through their element, they have control of their own bodies. But a boss should be able to manipulate the element outside of their form. They should be able to be a master of the element. And I think this is a fantastic mechanic for a lot of reasons, but really to highlight that point is that an air elemental, an elemental lord, as it were, will have control of something like that. And being able to toss them into the air has so many mechanics that allow for an interesting fight. You've got fall damage. You've got certain things like if you have multiple enemies, you have attacks of opportunity that you can trigger. You can break concentration. If you have another thing where perhaps if you don't suck them up, or maybe you can suck them in, and you can bring a caster into melee range, which, especially if you have several different type of adversaries, that disrupts everything that a caster might have been planning before, because now they're in melee range of any number of things. So this really is a mechanic that can add a lot of depth and interest to a fight.
I like the idea of you creating it, instead of a whirlwind, it makes a sort of tornado out of itself, sucking everything towards it instead of bouncing things away from it. I think that would be very interesting.
And on the same note, I know you had an idea about, and this is a very nefarious idea, but a mechanic in which you can use the breath, the holding of the breath, or something like that. Kind of equitable to drowning, but without water. So could you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, I was inspired, I think, if you haven't seen it, of the Legend of Korra villain, who is an air element, or an air bender, and he goes and kills the Earth Queen by sucking out the air out of his lungs. So why shouldn't a air elemental be able to do something similar? And
absolutely,
basically, air elementals get multi-attack. So give it another different type of attack other than its slam. Have that different attack be air siphoning, where it can literally pull the air out of a character's lungs if it hits with its attack. And after doing so, they are basically suffocating. And if you look at the suffocating rules, once they are in that state, they have as many rounds as their Constitution modifier before they go unconscious. And so if you have a barbarian with a Constitution of +4, and that gives him 4 rounds, which means this air elemental is going to have to maintain his attack on that barbarian each of those 4 rounds to keep the air bubble from sucking the air back into his lungs. So it gives a way for the air elemental to have more than just his slam attack action. He can then also maybe he uses 2 of those actions and he targets 2 people with it. And likely, if it's a boss air elemental, it's probably not as dumb as most other air elementals. It's probably going to target whoever it perceives as having the lowest constitution modifier.
Absolutely. For a barbarian with +4, just like you said, that may not be as serious of an attack, especially if, let's say, they missed the attack because of the DC or whatever, or the AC. For if you were to use that mechanic as its creator, then that wouldn't be as much of a challenge. But you pull in, let's say, a sorcerer, or let's say anything that has a lower constitution, because they don't necessarily need constitution. And let's make it a quick note. If you're not buffing your primary stat, you should always be buffing constitution.
Absolutely.
That is just a rule for any character and class. That's a free tip for you listeners out there. So yeah, let's say you decided to min-max and you buff your cleric, and you buffed your wisdom, and you buffed your strength, but you left your constitution at a 10 because your AC is 19.
Yeah, you're a forged cleric and you have a 21 armor class.
Right. Yeah, nothing's going to hit you, and so you don't necessarily have to worry about hit points that much. Well, in this case, you are wrong. Because you are now reduced to 1 or 2 rounds of this suffocation state, and suddenly this situation becomes much more dire for you. So I think this is a great mechanic, especially if you know your players as the DM. If you know their character sheets, you can be a little bit mean with this, and you can teach your players that, well, they shouldn't always expect to be this impenetrable wall of steel. Sometimes they're going to have to think on their feet.
Sometimes it does not matter that you have 100 hit points and you have a 25 armor class. There are many ways you can get around such things.
And that's the thing too, especially at higher levels. Your players will have large hit pools. That is just the thing, and they'll have high ACs. At this point, they have cloaks of protection. They're wearing all sorts of plate mail and elven chain and all this wonderful, these wonderful aspects of the game, but makes it more challenging for you. Because like, well, I have to either put a billion different adversaries on the field, or I'm going to have to create a boss and try to balance it that way, and they're going to kill me in 4 rounds anyways. What's the point? No. You can take an interesting mechanic, and even if the fight isn't long, because you've got a heavy crit paladin and you got a light cleric that's got like 4 different fireballs, you may have that. But let's say you can take that cleric who has a low constitution, and you can take them out of the fight, and suddenly this gets a little more scary for your players, and that is fun.
Oh yes, and especially like if this air elemental's bouncing people away from him, and he's using his action to take their air out of their lungs, have him use evasion tactics and eat up that time so that their concentration spells that they've been maintaining, that have that 1 minute duration, they only last 1 minute. Make him kite the players, and all of a sudden, your paladin has been sitting there waiting for his searing smite to pop off, fades away.
It's well, and you mentioned this earlier, is bump the AC. I think in this case, bumping the AC makes so much sense.
Absolutely.
Even if you don't increase the HP pool by that much, maybe if it's barely in the hundreds or whatever, you can bump the AC because they're trying to strike at air. Of course it would be hard to hit it. So yeah, I think there's so many mechanical opportunities with the air elemental that make it so interesting.
Absolutely.
So how else would you make the air elemental perhaps a little more powerful, a little more searing to your adventurers?
Well, there's a lot of wind-based. There's not a lot, but there are a couple wind-based spells that are in the various books that Wizards of the Coast has published. One that I think is very fun, but a little bit of a downer, is Gust of Wind, because it only has, like, I believe it's only a 5-foot wide space that it funnels to.
Mm-hmm.
You're the dungeon master, however. You don't have to abide by the same rules and whatnot that your players do when casting spells, because this doesn't even have to be a spell. This is an air elemental. It's probably a natural ability. Make it a 20-foot wide gust of wind that he can burst out at people, and then put your players on some sort of like platforms that are, if your world has a lot of floating cities or something like that, have a bunch of little miniature floating islands that they're hopping up and down around, and giving him many opportunities to gust of wind and shove. If they all end up stacking onto one island, he gust of winds and throws them all off of this island all as a group, or if they're smart and they're making him target people.
It's true. There's so many things you can do. And also, this is something that is hard to do in D&D, but possible. You can allow a mechanic that would kill a player to be part of the fight and part of your player's success, too. So let's say you position yourself as a player, kind of how you've learned the mechanic.
Yes.
You position yourself in such a way that you are, let's say, blown off this platform onto a lower tier or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now on the tier below you, there's a little bit of cover. There's a little bit of something that you can use to obscure yourself from the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
And you as the DM, you wrote it, you know it's there, and you want your players to discover it. And that's kind of a joy. You can have this silent conversation where, like, I'm giving you an opportunity to be creative and to be successful in this situation, and I don't want you to just do it by casting your highest level spell. You know
Absolutely.
what I mean?
Speaking of creativity, I think we're going to roll into a little bit of lair action and lair capabilities here.
Absolutely.
I was thinking it'd be amazing if there was some massive cyclone that was erupting out of a big old, in my mind, a cool way is if it was like in a massive pit. It's like 200 feet by 200 feet, and there's this cyclone just raging on the inside of it. And, it's been causing a lot of issues in the weather terrain around here. And so, the king or whoever, the regent, wants the players to go and get rid of the cyclone. And he sent other adventurers to this cyclone to try to do the same. And here's where you can hint to your players to maybe use a little bit different tactics. Maybe they run into like some bodies of different adventurers that had a bunch of grappling hooks, and along the edges of this massive pit there's a bunch of outcroppings or poles, something that they can attach these grappling hooks because if you're next to a cyclone, probably going to be making some strength saving throws to not get yanked into it and whirlwinded up while this thing is chasing you around and smacking you. Give them equipment that they can use creatively. It'll be at a detriment to their movement speed, but they will not be flung into the cyclone itself.
Oh, that's such a good... Here's the thing, and you know this, and you and I think we share a mutual love for use of equipment creatively. That's something that's so underrated in 5e specifically. Like, yes, you use thieves' tools to open doors or crowbars or whatever, and they give you advantage on skill checks. Fine, that's what they're for. But, if you have your grappling hook and you put it on your 50 feet of hempen rope and you tie it around a rock, and whenever they try to pull you 20 feet in the air, well, you don't go 20 feet. You only go 10 feet.
Exactly.
Or if they try to blast you away, you only go 10 feet away, not 20 feet. So it's these kinds of things where mechanically, especially if you anticipate how smart your party will be, because players are very smart if you give them the opportunity.
Yes.
You can facilitate that creativity with not only their strengths from gear, from spells or whatever, but with the things that they have, with their hempen rope, with their grappling hooks, with their their adhesives, or they have special magnetic boots or whatever. Like, there's so many things that you can allow them to use. So I love that.
Absolutely.
So we're talking about layers, and I love this idea that you kind of planted. So let's say I'm an adventurer. I'm walking into the lair of this thing. Can you paint me a picture of this elemental lord's lair?
So, as you crest over this hill and you begin to hear the roaring of the wind brushing past your face and your hair, whipping it over your eyes, forcing you to pull it back, you walk over, pulling yourself up over some rocks, and you see it. You see the massive torrential of wind picking up into the skies and disappearing amongst the clouds. Among it, you see outcroppings, islands, if you may, floating within the cyclone, ebbing up and down within it. And within, you see the glowing eyes of the great air elemental, the guardian of this location. And then you set the scene for them, and this thing probably knows that you're coming, so it's probably go time about right when you arrive. And unless you want to give them the time to suss it out, but I always enjoy thrusting my players into the chaos and watching whatever unfolds in their mind.
Yes, absolutely. Especially if this is, let's say, a specific chunk of adventure or a one-shot, you really want to allow your players to feel the moment and maybe do a little bit of role play. But if you know, and if they know that a fight is coming, well, why not force the narrative? Well, that's a strong way of putting it. Why not facilitate this epic fight that they have been anticipating? Don't railroad your players, but allow them to have the epic fights that they deserve. That's what I'm trying to say. So yes, oh man, just cresting that hill, peering over the rocks, and seeing this huge, powerful cyclone that is sucking in every piece of earth and iron, and it just looks so scary. I love that so much.
And then, maybe giving them a reason to where they have to eventually enter the cyclone. Maybe they know beforehand that there's totems or runes or magical items embedded in some of these little islands that are oscillating within the cyclone, and they have to go and maybe they have to cast a couple high-level dispel magic to get rid of some of these runes. And if you're going to do something like that, make sure that your players kind of know that's coming so that they know to keep some spell slots in reserve to handle that. Because if you're going to require like a level 6 dispel magic and they waste all their level 6 spells, and then it's like, well, got to come up with something else. But that could also put a nice little handicap on some of your spellcasters if they know they have to save those spell slots in order to disable this thing.
That's true. Yeah. I mean, no matter how many clues you give, sometimes players will use their resources for something else. And maybe it's a great decision, or maybe they just weren't anticipating having to use them. That's fine. It happens. I think this is when a rule of cool, which is an important idea, has to come into place. If they are creative enough, allow them to have a solution, as long as the dice giveth, in this case.
Narratively makes sense. The dice are glorious and they shine light on them.
That's true.
Things
and
sometimes
can always
work.
They'll fail as well. Yeah, so it can absolutely work, and then sometimes it won't. Sometimes it's an opportunity to continue the story in another way.
Absolutely.
That's a conversation for a different time. But I think this is part of the strength of creating something from a smaller, kind of weaker stat block in your quintessential air elemental. That's the opportunity that you can have. You can facilitate just a fantastic fight and a fantastic story.
Mm-hmm.
And if it doesn't go exactly to plan, well, you have another story that you can tell that's linked to this one. So I just love, and I think part of this series, this idea of boss builds, is that we are taking this quintessential element of Dungeons and Dragons and boosting it and not having to create something from nothing, but taking something that exists and making it something really special.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any thoughts on some lair abilities or ways that this air elemental can manipulate its lair and its lair abilities in conjunction?
Sure, yeah. Well, if, let's say, I have two ideas. Well, and they're lair specific. So let's say you're powerful enough, your players are powerful enough that they are planeswalkers or they're given an opportunity to go to a different plane. If they were allowed to go to the air elemental plane, or the air elemental plane in which the air elementals reside, then let's say for some reason, some deity or some grand cleric or whatever gave them the facilities to have like flying boots. This could be kind of like a one-shot thing, and they could very much like have their own flight speed, and suddenly your fight becomes three-dimensional, and your elemental is blasting them away, and they're flying back on their kind of their winged boots. And let's say the air elemental decided to suck one boot off of your barbarian. Suddenly he's only got one, and he's kind of like flying in circles. And it's a situation in which you can use these same mechanics that we've talked about. You can use the suffocation. You can use the gusts of wind. And it doesn't put your players at too much of a disadvantage because they do have this equipment that allows them to move within that space. So that could be something that's fun. It introduces all sorts of different types of fight mechanics as well. So that's something that you'd have to really design. It is a design layer.
Yes.
Another thing that perhaps is more dangerous but very dramatic, this is the other layer that I was thinking of, is let's say you're at the top of a mage's tower, and this very powerful kind of archmage has captured an air elemental that has grown so powerful that it's bursting from its bonds and wreaking all sorts of havoc. And so you go and you venture through this mage's tower, vanquishing so many challenges, and you get to the top, and suddenly this air elemental is conjuring winds and storms, and there's so much electricity and anger that's exuding from this kind of air elemental. And suddenly you're on a circle arena on the top of this tower, and if you go past the borders, you're going to fall a long way down. So you have to be careful with how you approach it and learn its mechanics very quickly. And so that's a fight that's much more dangerous, but the narrative elements and the kind of the sense of danger that you get from observing your surroundings really turns it up from a 5 to a 10.
Yeah,
those are the two types of things that I was thinking of.
Yeah, when you look around your battlefield and you have this air elemental who tried its whirlwind once, and maybe you guys got lucky and all of you succeeded, but you then are aware, oh shoot, we're only on a 20-foot wide tower, and this thing is trying to fling us off. We're gonna have to figure out some way to like anchor ourselves and stay here, and so we can continue this fight.
Absolutely. And this is where your item mechanics come in. This is when you best hope that one caster has Featherfall or something like that. This is where you have to get really creative just to survive, not only to succeed, but to survive.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I think that is a great couple of abilities, and potential layers that you guys can use for some air elemental fun in your one-shots or
Absolutely.
campaigns. And if you guys have any ideas that you've come up with pertaining to air elementals or really anything, always we are 100% we want to read everything that you guys come up with, especially if it pertains to creative things that you take from some other source and you make it into your own thing. We want to know all about it. And you can find us anywhere: YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can email us, whichever way is most convenient for you.
Yes, absolutely. We want to hear about your creations, your stories. I want to read them. I want to live them. I know that Boulder feels the same. We are so passionate about other people's creations, as we don't want to just give you our ideas, but we want to have your ideas too and experience them because we know that they are so fantastic. So please reach out to us.
And with that, I think that is a good spot to end today's Boss Builds Air Elemental edition. And I hope all of you dun dun dun. And I hope all of you have a beautiful day.